The Ford foxbody is arguably the best drag racing chassis of all time. That's 79 to 93 Mustangs, Mercury Capris, Mercury Marquis, not Grand Marquis, even Ford LTDs and Fairmonts. That's an LTD behind me. But what makes it so great? Well, it's because it sucks at everything else. A Tesla Plaid is the quickest car that you can buy that's reasonably affordable and accessible. On its best day on a prep track, a Plaid will typically run 9.2s at about 150 miles an hour in the quarter mile. Now, fox bodies have been running in the 7s since the 90s. And since then, there have been 5-second foxes. That's 5 seconds in the quarter, not the 8th. If you're not a drag racing person, let me put that into perspective for you. By the time the Tesla Plaid gets to the halfway mark, the foxbody's already finished the race. And by the time the Tesla Plaid gets to the finish line, it's going over 100 miles an hour slower than the Mustang is. That's pretty amazing, particularly for a chassis that was designed in the 70s, and it was designed to be an economy car, not a muscle car, not a drag racer, none of that. This was in a period of time where the body-on-frame cars were going away and unibody cars were beginning to come into their own. Ford engineers were tasked with building a cheap, light, affordable car with minimal parts count. That's the foxbody. Now, before we get under the car, there's one concept that you kind of need to wrap your head around, and it's a pretty simple one. It's the concept of pivot points. A suspension is nothing but a bunch of pivot points. When you have a control arm with a pivot point here, and it's parallel to the ground, it's this long. But if the suspension compresses and the end of the control arm goes up, suddenly it's shorter. And if it extends, it's shorter again. And that is both the strengths and the shortcomings of the foxbody suspension. Now let's get under the car and take a look. So we're gonna start at the front of the car because the back of the car is what we're really interested in, but the front of the car, I can illustrate the whole problem with the suspension and why fox bodies in general don't turn all that well. But before we do that, let me just explain really quickly one of the best types of front suspension, and that's a double wishbone. That would be 2 control arms parallel with each other like this. I'm gonna illustrate it with my arms this way because otherwise we're gonna end up doing the YMCA thing and ain't nobody got time for that. So we're gonna pretend this is the upper control arm and this is the lower control arm. And you have a spindle in between and the wheel right in the middle. So as the suspension travels, both arms get equally shorter and longer. So in this plane, it stays parallel. That's a good front suspension. Yeah, the wheel travels in and out, but whatever camber you set that front wheel to, it keeps that camber. Now let's take a look what happens on a Fox. So welcome to the front suspension of a fox body. So you'll notice there's only one control arm here. That's it. The upper point is actually the strut mount, which is mounted to the strut tower. That doesn't pivot. Obviously, it moves a little bit. There's a little play in there. In this case, this car has caster camber plates, so it does have an actual steel joint up there. But down here, this is the only thing that moves. So when this tilts up and down, it pulls the bottom of the wheel in as it travels. So right now the control arm is basically parallel with the ground, which is good. However, if this compresses, like when you're taking a hard corner, it's gonna remember the whole pivot thing. It's gonna pivot up and get shorter and pull the bottom of the wheel in, which is gonna get rid of your negative camber, which is exactly what you don't want under load during a turn. That is a major shortcoming of the Fox chassis. But the advantage is fewer parts, one control arm. Not great for handling. There are compromise aftermarket solutions to improve it. That is the biggest shortcoming of the front fox body suspension. There's also a bump steer issue that happens here. Same thing, there's a pivot inside the inner tie rod end here. And when this travels through its range of motion, it will actually tow the car in as the suspension compresses or extends. Not great, not terrible. It works, it gets you down the road, but it's really best at going in a straight line. Now, the real secret and the real magic of the Fox is in the back. Let's go take a look at that. So welcome to the back end of a 9-second Fox body. This is about as basic as you get. This is like the core old school suspension and it works beautifully. The only aftermarket parts here is the airbag and the coil spring. I know it's old school, but it works. And what that does is it keeps the car from torquing over. Generally, For max torque over resistance, I put about 45 PSI in the thing, but that makes it kind of ride funky going in a straight line, so I prefer to keep it around 30, 35, somewhere in there. These are the secret sauce. These are HPM Megabyte Juniors. Now, normally when you think of Junior, you think of, well, I want the senior version. No, if you can actually find these, they stopped making these years ago, but if you can actually find a set of these, and I found these after they stopped making them, these are what you really want. And it will become apparent why in a minute. But what these do is they relocate the bottom pivot points on the axle. So when a car takes off, the axle wants to force itself this way. And what ends up happening is you end up with a force pushing up over here. By the way, just ignore all the rubber there. This car may have been raced once or twice. In fact, yeah. There's a bit of rubber. I just made a mess. Anyway, back to your regularly scheduled program. This wants to wrap this way, and what that does is it pushes forward on this, but when you move this pivot point down, that forward push becomes more of an upward push. And what you really want in a rear suspension is you don't want the back end of a car to squat. Everybody says, oh, look at that squat. That's actually a bad thing. That means the tire is getting sucked up into the wheel well, and therefore it's pulled off the track. You want the back end to separate, which means it's shoving the tire into the track, giving you maximum traction. And that's what this allows you to do. There's actually 2 bolt holes here. It's on the lowest or most aggressive setting, because if it was here, obviously you would get more force pushing forward and less force pushing up. But when the force pushes up, it lifts the car body and puts more additional weight on the tire, giving you more traction. That's one of the beauties of the Fox suspension. Now, this is the upper control arm. This is a 4-link suspension. It's got the 2 lower control arms, and they are actually going slightly outward. And these are going very much inward, as you can see, inward towards the rear axle, that is. That triangulation of the upper control arms going this way and the lower control arms going that way is literally the only thing that locates the rear. There is no panhard rod. A panhard rod would be a fixed point here and a pivot, and then to the chassis maybe there. So when the suspension travels through its range of motion, it goes up and down. It prevents the rear from going left to right. But obviously, because remember the whole thing with the pivots, as it travels up and down, the rear will move side to side, but it's not free to move side to side. It's locked in by this rod. Less parts. This is what Ford engineers designed. So are you seeing what the problem is here? You have these control arms, and they're all kinds of weird angles. And remember what I said about you want Megabyte Juniors, not seniors. The difference between the two is these have rubber bushings in them, or actually they're polyurethane bushings, and these have rubber bushings. Well, think about what's going to happen when the suspension compresses and extends. These things are all at wacky angles to each other, and again, as they pivot, they change length. So what's going to happen is if you compress the suspension too much, it's going to bind, which is why you cannot have solid pivots here, or even here or here, but to a lesser extent. Because if you put solid, let's say you put solid bushings in here, this thing is going to bind under the slightest compression. That is a weak link. And as long as you're going in a straight line, the traction is incredible. That is about the most concise explanation I can think of why the Fox body is so great at drag racing and kind of sucks at most other things. But I did also want to mention that the suspension that's on this car is a very common, very basic, but very effective drag race suspension. It definitely does work quite well, but you're really not going to go much faster than 8s. Maybe if you're a little nuts, you might go 7s on something like this. But once you start getting quicker than that, that's when you start looking at much more advanced suspension solutions. However, for most Fox bodies that can be pretty quick at the track, this is a very basic, very good setup. Now, obviously, we've got the dyno jet here. We're just waiting on one more sensor to show up, and it's apparently stuck in customs, as I found out today. But definitely subscribe, because the dyno testing starts in the next video. And of course, I didn't forget your moment of Roger. Roger. Sharpay. Roger. Sharpay. Roger. Sharpay.